The water bottle hit Mia Chen's desk with enough force to send her carefully organized notes scattering across the classroom floor. The sudden crash made her jump, her pencil skittering away as 28 pairs of eyes turned to watch her scramble to collect the papers that represented 3 hours of meticulous preparation for today's presentation. But it wasn't the mess that made her heart race or her hands shake as she knelt between the desks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It was the knowledge that in exactly 4 minutes, when Mrs. Henderson called her name, she would have to stand in front of these same classmates and attempt to speak about the Revolutionary War without her tongue betraying her the way it always did. Mia had been practicing her presentation since the assignment was given 2 weeks ago. Every night after dinner, she stood in front of her bedroom mirror, forcing herself to speak slowly, to breathe between sentences, to imagine the words flowing smoothly from her lips like they did for everyone else. Her mother would listen from the hallway sometimes, and Mia could hear the quiet sadness in her silence, the unspoken wish that her 17-year-old daughter could navigate the world without the weight of a stutter that had followed her since childhood. The truth was that Mia Chen had 2 voices. There was the voice that stumbled and caught on consonants, that made ordering food at restaurants an exercise in humiliation, and answering questions in class a form of voluntary torture. Then there was the voice that existed only in her head, articulate and confident, the voice that wrote poetry in 3 languages, and could debate philosophy with the precision of a scholar. The gap between these 2 voices had defined her existence at Lincoln High School, where being different was often the same as being invisible. She finished gathering her papers, noting that several had footprints on them now, courtesy of Jake Williams, who had somehow managed to step on her work while making his way back to his seat. Jake was one of Chloe Martinez's satellites, part of the group that had made Mia's junior year a careful dance of avoidance and strategic invisibility. As she straightened up, smoothing the wrinkled pages, she caught sight of Chloe watching her with that particular expression she'd perfected, a mixture of amusement and disdain that suggested she found Mia's existence mildly entertaining in the way one might find a struggling insect amusing. Chloe Martinez ruled Lincoln High with the kind of effortless authority that came from being blessed with everything the teenage social hierarchy valued. At 17, she possessed the kind of natural beauty that made adults stop mid-sentence and peers move aside in hallways. Her father owned the largest construction company in their small Oregon town of Willowbrook, and her mother had been homecoming queen at the same high school 20 years earlier. Chloe's Instagram account had 12,000 followers, her boyfriend Ryan was the captain of the basketball team, and her group of friends moved through the school like visiting royalty, dispensing approval and judgment with equal measure. What made Chloe particularly dangerous wasn't her popularity or her looks or even her family's money. It was her intelligence. She was smart enough to make her cruelty seem almost accidental, sophisticated enough to wound with precision while maintaining plausible deniability. Her favorite targets were the students who couldn't fight back effectively, and in Mia Chen, she had found the perfect victim. A girl whose stutter made verbal retaliation nearly impossible, whose quiet nature ensured she would never seek help, and whose academic success made her a threat that needed to be neutralized. The harassment had started subtly during the first week of junior year. Chloe would ask Mia questions in front of others, innocent queries about homework or weekend plans that required verbal responses. She would wait with apparent patience as Mia struggled through her answers, nodding sympathetically while her friends exchanged glances. "Take your time," Chloe would say sweetly, her voice dripping with false concern. "We know it's hard for you." The humiliation was exquisite in its precision, designed to look like kindness to any teacher or adult who might overhear while delivering maximum psychological damage to its target. As the weeks passed, the attacks had grown bolder. Chloe discovered that Mia's stutter worsened under stress, so she began creating situations designed to maximize anxiety. She would volunteer Mia to read aloud in classes they shared, enthusiastically suggesting to teachers that Mia should present first or answer difficult questions. "Mia's so smart," she would say with a bright smile. "I'm sure she knows the answer." Then, she would sit back and watch as Mia struggled through responses, her words catching and stumbling while Chloe's friends snickered behind their hands. The cruelty had an almost scientific quality to it. Chloe studied Mia's patterns, learning exactly which sounds gave her the most trouble, which situations triggered the worst episodes. She discovered that words beginning with hard consonants were particularly challenging, so she began steering conversations toward topics that would force Mia to use those sounds. She learned that being put on the spot in front of groups made everything worse, so she made sure to create those situations whenever possible. Mia understood what was happening, but understanding and stopping it were two entirely different things. Every attempt to avoid Chloe only seemed to make her more determined. When Mia stopped eating lunch in the cafeteria, Chloe began seeking her out in the library, asking loud questions about homework that drew attention from other students trying to study. When Mia tried to blend into the background during group projects, Chloe would specifically request her as a partner, then insist she present their findings to the class. The worst part wasn't even the public humiliation, though that was considerable. It was the way Chloe had turned Mia's stutter into entertainment for others. Students who had never paid attention to Mia before now watched her with anticipation whenever she was forced to speak, waiting to see if this would be one of the times when her words would tangle beyond recognition. Some even started making quiet bets on how long it would take her to complete a sentence, treating her disability like a spectator sport. Mrs. Henderson was calling names now, moving through the presentation schedule with methodical precision. Mia's hands had stopped shaking, replaced by the familiar numbness that preceded her worst speaking episodes. She had tried everything over the years: speech therapy that had helped but never cured, breathing exercises that worked in isolation but failed under pressure, medication that made her drowsy without addressing the core problem. The stutter wasn't just about speech mechanics. It was neurological, deeply embedded in the way her brain processed language under stress. What none of her classmates knew, what even her parents had never fully understood, was that Mia's stutter disappeared completely in certain situations. When she was alone, reading aloud to herself, her voice flowed like water. When she spoke to animals at the shelter where she volunteered, the words came easily. And most remarkably, when she was practicing karate, calling out techniques in Japanese, her speech was flawless. Mia had discovered martial arts by accident 3 years earlier. Her mother, desperate to help her daughter build confidence, had enrolled her in a summer program at Master Tanaka's dojo downtown. The idea was that physical activity might reduce the anxiety that seemed to worsen her speech problems. What happened instead was something neither of them had expected. The dojo operated under different rules than the rest of the world. Here, respect was earned through discipline and dedication, not social status or family wealth. Master Tanaka, a 70-year-old man who had immigrated from Japan 40 years earlier, cared nothing for high school hierarchies or teenage politics. He saw only students willing to learn and students who were not. Mia, desperate for a place where her voice didn't matter, threw herself into training with an intensity that surprised everyone, including herself. Karate gave her something she had never experienced before, a form of communication that didn't rely on words. The techniques spoke for themselves, each movement carrying meaning and intention. In kata, the formal patterns of movement that were the heart of traditional karate, she found a kind of poetry that required no verbal expression. Her body could articulate thoughts and emotions that her voice had never been able to convey. Master Tanaka noticed her dedication immediately. While other students chatted between exercises or complained about the difficulty of techniques, Mia practiced in focused silence. She arrived early and stayed late, working on forms until they became second nature. She absorbed instruction like a sponge, her analytical mind breaking down each movement and rebuilding it with mathematical precision. The transformation wasn't immediate, but it was profound. Months of training built not just physical strength, but mental discipline. The meditation aspects of traditional karate taught her to control her breathing, to center her thoughts, to find calm in the midst of chaos. She learned that true power came not from aggression, but from balance, not from domination, but from understanding. Master Tanaka's philosophy emphasized that martial arts were a tool for building character, not destroying opponents. By the end of her first year, Mia had earned her green belt and the quiet respect of the other students. By the end of her second year, she was competing in regional tournaments, her precise technique and unwavering focus earning her medals and recognition. Now, in her third year of training, she held a brown belt and was being considered for black belt testing. She had become formidable in ways that had nothing to do with speech, powerful in ways that her tormentors could never understand. The irony was not lost on her that the same physical control that made her a devastating martial artist had no effect on her stutter. She could break boards with her bare hands, execute throws that could disable opponents twice her size, and move with the fluid grace of someone who had spent thousands of hours perfecting their craft. But ask her to order pizza over the phone, and she would still struggle with the simplest words. Her parents knew she took martial arts classes, but they had no real understanding of her skill level. They saw it as therapy, a way to build confidence and manage stress. They attended the occasional tournament, proud, but puzzled by their quiet daughter's success in such a physical pursuit. They didn't understand that for Mia, karate wasn't just a hobby or even a passion. It was a second identity, a version of herself that existed without limitations. At school, she was careful never to mention her training. The few times it had come up in conversation, she had deflected or changed the subject. Partly this was due to her natural reluctance to draw attention to herself, but partly it was strategic. She had learned early that being underestimated was often an advantage. People made assumptions about quiet, stuttering girls, and those assumptions created blind spots that could be useful. "Mia Chen," Mrs. Henderson called, and the familiar spike of adrenaline hit her nervous system like a drug. This was the moment she had been dreading for 2 weeks, the inevitable collision between her two worlds. Around her, she could sense the shift in attention, the way conversations stopped and heads turned. Someone behind her whispered something that sounded like, "This should be good," and she heard the barely suppressed laughter that followed. She stood slowly, gathering her notes with hands that had learned to be steady through years of practice. The walk to the front of the classroom felt endless, each step measured and deliberate. She had learned not to rush these moments, not to let anxiety drive her actions. Breathing deeply, she turned to face her classmates, her presentation materials arranged on the podium before her. The title of her presentation was Communication and Power in Revolutionary America, a topic she had chosen specifically because it would force her to confront her own relationship with both concepts. She had researched it thoroughly, crafting arguments that were sophisticated and original. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In her head, the presentation was brilliant, a 20-minute exploration of how different forms of communication had shaped the course of history. In reality, she knew she would be lucky to get through the first paragraph without major difficulty. Chloe was sitting in the third row, her perfect smile already in place. Ryan sat beside her, his attention focused on his phone, but his presence adding to the performance. Jake and Madison, two of Chloe's closest allies, had positioned themselves strategically around the room, ready to amplify whatever entertainment might follow. They had done this before, turning Mia's required presentations into informal spectacles that would be discussed and replayed for days afterward. Take your time, Mia," Chloe said loudly enough for the whole class to hear, her voice honey-sweet with false encouragement. "We're all really excited to hear what you have to say." The mimicry was subtle but unmistakable, just a slight exaggeration of certain sounds that anyone could dismiss as coincidence while hitting Mia like a physical blow. Mrs. Henderson, grading papers at her desk, looked up briefly but said nothing. This was the standard pattern. Chloe's behavior was always just ambiguous enough to avoid direct intervention, just cruel enough to be devastating to its target. The teacher's silence was its own form of complicity, a message that some students were worth protecting and others were not. Mia looked down at her notes, the words swimming slightly as her stress response kicked into high gear. This was the moment when her stutter would typically worsen, when the anticipation of failure would create the very failure she feared. She could feel her tongue preparing to betray her, her throat tightening in the familiar pattern that preceded her worst episodes. But something different happened this time. Instead of panic, she felt a strange calm settling over her, the same centered feeling she experienced before competing in tournaments. Her breathing steadied automatically, drawing on years of meditation training. Her posture straightened, shoulders settling into the balanced stance that had become second nature. She looked up from her notes and met Chloe's expectant gaze directly. "The Revolutionary War," she began, and her voice caught immediately on the hard consonant. The familiar spike of anxiety hit her, followed by the sound of barely suppressed snickering from somewhere in the room. But instead of spiraling into panic, she paused, breathed deeply, and tried again. The Revolutionary War was fought with more than just guns and bayonets, she continued, her words halting but determined. It was a war of ideas, of CC communication, of competing narratives about PP power and freedom. The stutter was there, persistent and obvious, but she pushed through it with the same determination she brought to breaking boards or learning new techniques. Each word was a small victory, each completed sentence a demonstration of will over limitation. She could see Chloe's satisfaction growing with each stumble, but she could also see something else. A slight confusion in the other girl's expression, as if something about this performance wasn't quite matching expectations. The CC Continental Congress understood that winning hearts and minds was as important as winning BB battles, Mia continued, gaining momentum despite the obstacles. They used PP pamphlets, newspapers, and public speeches to CC convince colonists that independence was not just PP possible but necessary. She was hitting her stride now, finding a rhythm that worked around her stutter rather than fighting it. The presentation was good, her research thorough, and her arguments compelling. Several students who had been expecting entertainment were actually listening, drawn in despite themselves by the quality of her content. But Chloe wasn't satisfied with passive observation. She had learned that Mia's stutter worsened when she was interrupted or put under additional pressure. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, raising her hand with false politeness, "but I'm having trouble understanding some of your words. Could you maybe speak more clearly?" The request was perfectly reasonable on its surface, the kind of thing any student might ask during a presentation. But delivered with Chloe's particular tone and timing, it was clearly designed to derail Mia's fragile momentum. The comment drew knowing looks from her allies and uncomfortable shifts from other students who recognized the cruelty but didn't know how to respond. Mrs. Henderson looked up again, her expression uncertain. "Let's let Mia finish her presentation, Chloe. You can ask questions afterward." "Oh, I don't have any questions," Chloe replied innocently. "I just want to make sure everyone can understand what she's saying. It's not fair to her if we can't follow along because of her, speech problem." The phrase speech problem landed like a slap, reducing 3 years of progress and thousands of hours of therapy to a casual dismissal. It was exactly the kind of comment that would typically send Mia into a downward spiral, her anxiety spiking to levels that made coherent speech nearly impossible. Instead, something unexpected happened. Mia felt her training kick in, the mental discipline she had spent years developing asserting itself. She recognized the attack for what it was, an attempt to disrupt her balance, to throw her off center. In karate, such attacks were met not with panic but with technical response, not with emotion but with strategy. She looked directly at Chloe, her stance unconsciously shifting into the balanced position she adopted before executing techniques. Her breathing remained steady, controlled by years of practice. When she spoke again, her voice carried a quality that hadn't been there before, a kind of quiet intensity that made several students look up from their phones. "You're right that C communication can be difficult," she said, her words deliberate and measured. The C colonists faced the same challenge. How do you get your message across when the PP people in power don't want to hear it? How do you find your voice when others are trying to silence you? The parallel was unmistakable, and the classroom fell silent in a way that had nothing to do with boredom. Mia had just turned Chloe's attack into the central theme of her presentation, transforming personal weakness into historical insight. It was a move worthy of the strategic thinking that had made her a formidable competitor in martial arts tournaments. Chloe's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the response she had been expecting. Usually, her interruptions left Mia flustered and unable to recover. Instead, the quiet girl seemed to be growing stronger, more focused with each challenge. "Some of the most PP powerful communication in history has come from people who faced obstacles," Mia continued, her confidence building. Frederick Douglass had to overcome the barriers of slavery and illiteracy. Helen Keller had to find ways to communicate without sight or hearing. Sometimes the struggle to be heard makes the message more PP powerful, not less. She was hitting her stride now, the presentation flowing despite her stutter. Her research was impeccable, her arguments sophisticated, her delivery gaining power from the very obstacles she was overcoming. Students who had come to watch her fail were instead witnessing something remarkable. a demonstration of grace under pressure that had nothing to do with perfect speech and everything to do with determination. But Chloe wasn't finished. She had spent months learning exactly which tactics caused Mia the most distress, and she wasn't going to let this presentation succeed. "I'm sorry," she said, interrupting again with practiced timing. "But this is really hard to follow. Maybe you should just give us your notes to read, instead of trying to talk through it?" The suggestion was devastating in its apparent helpfulness. It offered Mia an escape from the struggle, while simultaneously highlighting her inadequacy. It was the kind of public humiliation that would normally send her retreating into silence, accepting defeat, rather than continuing to expose herself to ridicule. Instead, Mia did something that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She smiled. It wasn't a large smile, just a slight upturn at the corners of her mouth, but it transformed her entire expression. For the first time since she had known her, Chloe saw something in Mia's eyes that hadn't been there before. Not fear, not embarrassment, but something that looked almost like amusement. "That's an interesting suggestion," Mia said, her voice carrying a new quality that made several students lean forward. "It reminds me of something that happened during the Boston Tea Party. The British offered the CC colonists an easy way out, a CC compromise that would have avoided conflict. But sometimes the easy way isn't the right way. Sometimes you have to stand up and speak, even when your voice shakes." The metaphor was so perfect, so clearly directed at the current situation, that even Mrs. Henderson looked up with interest. Mia had just compared her struggle with stuttering to the American Revolution, and somehow it worked. The comparison elevated her personal challenge into something universal, something heroic. Chloe's expression had changed completely. The confident amusement was gone, replaced by something closer to uncertainty. She was beginning to realize that her usual tactics weren't working, that somehow the quiet girl she had been tormenting for months was not responding according to script. "The CC colonists could have stayed quiet," Mia continued, her presentation now taking on a power that had nothing to do with perfect diction. "They could have accepted the status quo, avoided CC conflict, chosen the path of least resistance. But they understood that some things are worth fighting for. Some voices are worth raising, even when they shake." She paused, looking around the room at faces that were no longer smirking or bored but actually engaged. Her stutter was still there, persistent and obvious, but it had somehow stopped being a weakness and started being a strength. Each difficult word became a small act of courage. Each completed sentence of victory over limitation. "The power of communication doesn't come from perfection," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "It comes from truth. It comes from the courage to speak when speaking is hard. It comes from refusing to be silenced by those who would rather you disappear." The silence that followed was different from the expectant quiet that had preceded her presentation. This was the silence of recognition, of a room full of teenagers realizing they were witnessing something significant. Even students who had never paid attention to Mia before were looking at her with new interest, seeing her perhaps for the first time not as a source of entertainment, but as a person with something important to say. Chloe made one last attempt to regain control of the situation. "Well, that's a very creative interpretation," she said, her voice carrying the patronizing tone she used when she wanted to dismiss someone's ideas while appearing reasonable. "But don't you think you're being a bit dramatic? I mean, it's just a presentation about old history. Nobody's trying to silence anybody." The comment was perfectly calibrated to minimize Mia's achievement while maintaining Chloe's position as the voice of reason. It was the kind of subtle undermining she had perfected over months of psychological warfare. But this time, instead of succeeding, it exposed her more clearly than any direct attack could have. Mia looked at Chloe for a long moment, and in that look was 3 years of training in reading opponents, in recognizing attacks before they fully developed, in understanding the difference between true threats and mere posturing. What she saw in Chloe's expression wasn't strength or confidence, but something much more familiar: fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being exposed, fear of facing someone who was no longer afraid. "You're right," Mia said quietly, her stutter mysteriously absent from those 2 words. "Nobody's trying to silence anybody. At least, not successfully." She turned back to her notes, but she didn't need them anymore. The presentation had become something else entirely, a demonstration not just of historical knowledge, but of personal strength. She spoke for 10 more minutes about communication strategies in the Revolutionary War, her voice growing steadier and more confident with each passing minute. When she finished, the applause was genuine and sustained. Students who had come to mock stayed to appreciate. Mrs. Henderson, who had been grading papers throughout most presentations that semester, had stopped working entirely and listened to every word. As Mia walked back to her seat, she passed Chloe's desk. For just a moment, their eyes met, and in that brief exchange, something fundamental shifted. Chloe saw something in Mia's gaze that she had never seen before, not fear or submission, but the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered her own strength. Mia took her seat and began organizing her notes, her hands steady and her breathing calm. The presentation was over, but something else was just beginning. For 3 years, she had endured Chloe's harassment in silence, absorbing attacks and accepting humiliation as the price of invisibility. But today had changed something essential in the dynamic between them. Today, Chloe had learned that Mia Chen was no longer the frightened, helpless girl she had been targeting. She was someone else entirely. Someone with hidden depths. Someone with unexpected strength. Someone who might not continue to accept abuse without consequence. As the bell rang and students began filing out of the classroom, Chloe lingered at her desk, her confident smile replaced by something closer to calculation. She was already planning her next move, her next attempt to regain control of a situation that had somehow slipped from her grasp. What she didn't understand was that the girl she had been tormenting for months was not the same person who had stood at the front of the classroom today. Mia Chen was no longer just a victim with a stutter and a secret. She was someone who had found her voice, even if that voice still caught on certain sounds. She was someone who had learned that strength came not from perfection, but from perseverance, not from silence, but from speaking truth despite difficulty. And most importantly, she was someone who was no longer afraid. The real confrontation was still to come, but the foundation had been laid. Chloe Martinez had built her power on the assumption that certain people would always remain weak, always stay silent, always accept their assigned place in the social hierarchy. Today, she had discovered that assumptions could be dangerous things, especially when they involved underestimating someone who had spent 3 years learning exactly how much force could be applied before something broke. The presentation had ended, but the real education was just beginning. The victory of the presentation lasted exactly 18 hours. Mia arrived at school the next morning to find her locker decorated with a collection of speech therapy pamphlets, each one carefully taped to the metal surface with bright pink duct tape. Someone had taken the time to highlight certain phrases in fluorescent yellow: overcoming communication disorders, help for severe stuttering, and when words won't come. The display was visible from 3 different hallways, positioned perfectly to catch the attention of anyone passing between classes. Chloe stood 20 feet away, surrounded by her usual entourage, watching Mia's reaction with the focused intensity of a scientist observing an experiment. She had spent the previous evening planning this response, coordinating with her friends to ensure maximum impact. The presentation had been an unexpected setback, a crack in the careful structure of dominance she had built over months of psychological warfare. This was her counterstrike, designed to remind everyone that yesterday's small victory meant nothing in the larger war for social supremacy. Mia stared at the pamphlets for a long moment, her backpack heavy on her shoulders and her breath visible in the cold morning air. Students were beginning to notice, slowing their pace to take in the spectacle. She could hear whispers starting to spread, the particular buzz that preceded viral humiliation in the connected world of high school social media. By lunch, photos of her locker would be circulating on every platform, accompanied by captions that would reduce yesterday's triumph to today's punchline. The old Mia would have torn down the pamphlets quickly, head down and face burning with shame. She would have spent the day hiding in empty classrooms and unused stairwells, waiting for the attention to move on to someone else's misfortune. But the girl standing in front of the decorated locker was not quite the same person who had endured 3 years of systematic harassment. Something fundamental had shifted during yesterday's presentation, a recognition of strength that had been dormant but never absent. Instead of rushing to remove the display, Mia examined each pamphlet carefully, reading the highlighted sections with genuine interest. She pulled out her phone and took several photos of the arrangement, documenting the care that had gone into the selection and placement. The action confused the growing crowd of observers, who had expected embarrassment but were witnessing something closer to clinical curiosity. "Interesting research," she said loudly enough for nearby students to hear, her voice carrying only the slightest tremor. "Though I think you missed some of the more current studies on neurological SS speech patterns. The highlighted sections are from 2019 research that's been largely SS superseded by more recent findings." The response was so unexpected that several students laughed, not at her stutter, but at the complete reversal of the intended dynamic. Chloe's carefully orchestrated humiliation had been transformed into an impromptu lesson on speech pathology research. The highlighted pamphlets, meant to emphasize Mia's disability, became evidence of thorough academic preparation rather than mockery. Chloe's smile tightened slightly, the first visible crack in her composed facade. This wasn't how the scenario was supposed to unfold. Her attacks relied on shame and silence, on the target's desperate desire to avoid attention. When that shame was replaced by analytical detachment, the entire psychological framework collapsed. "Oh, we thought you might find them helpful," Madison Pierce chimed in, stepping forward with the kind of aggressive helpfulness that barely concealed its malicious intent. Madison was Chloe's primary lieutenant, a girl whose own insecurities made her particularly vicious toward anyone she perceived as weaker. "We noticed you were still having trouble with your words yesterday, even during your little speech about courage or whatever." The emphasis on little speech was designed to minimize yesterday's presentation, to reduce it to something childish and inconsequential. It was a standard technique in Chloe's arsenal: acknowledge the target's small victories, only to dismiss them as meaningless. The goal was to create doubt, to make the victim question whether their moments of strength were real or imagined. Mia finished photographing the pamphlets and began removing them one by one, folding each carefully and placing them in her backpack. The deliberate nature of her actions drew more attention than frantic removal would have, turning the crowd of observers into an audience for whatever came next. "Actually, the information on neuroplasticity in these older studies is quite fascinating," she said, continuing her impromptu lecture while students gathered in a loose circle around her locker. They focus primarily on traditional SS speech therapy approaches, but more recent research suggests that multimodal training can be incredibly effective. Physical disciplines that require precise mental focus, for instance, can create new neural pathways that bypass traditional speech processing centers. She was describing her own experience with karate without revealing it, explaining the science behind why her speech improved during martial arts training. But to the growing audience, it sounded like she was delivering an academic lecture on cutting-edge research. The stutter was still there, but it had become part of a larger demonstration of knowledge rather than a source of vulnerability. Jake Williams, emboldened by Chloe's presence and the size of the crowd, decided to escalate the situation. "Jesus, just talk normally," he said, his voice loud enough to carry down the hallway. "Nobody wants to listen to you stumble through a whole lecture. Some of us have actual classes to get to." The comment was crude and direct, lacking Chloe's sophisticated subtlety but carrying the weight of masculine aggression that often proved effective in shutting down unwanted behavior. Jake had learned that teenage girls, even confident ones, usually retreated when faced with open hostility from popular boys. It was a reliable tactic that had worked countless times before, but Mia had spent 3 years training with people who could break her bones without effort, learning to maintain composure under physical and psychological pressure that made high school social dynamics seem almost quaint. She looked at Jake with the same measured assessment she might give a sparring partner before a match, evaluating strengths, weaknesses, and probable patterns of attack. "You're absolutely right that most people don't want to listen to lectures in hallways," she agreed, her tone conversational rather than defensive. "That's why it's so interesting that this CC conversation started with someone else deciding to create an educational DD display about speech disorders. I was just providing context for the materials they selected." The logical precision of her response left Jake momentarily speechless. She had acknowledged his complaint while simultaneously pointing out that he was criticizing her for responding to an attack rather than initiating one. It was a verbal Aikido move, using his own aggression against him while appearing completely reasonable. Chloe recognized the danger immediately. Her carefully constructed scenario was slipping out of control, transforming from a demonstration of power into something that made her group look petty and small. Mia was supposed to be the one looking foolish, not the popular kids who had orchestrated the prank. The dynamic needed to be corrected quickly before lasting damage was done to carefully maintained reputations. "Look, we were just trying to help," Chloe said, stepping forward with her most sincere expression. "We all heard how hard yesterday was for you, struggling through that presentation. We thought maybe some professional resources might make things easier. There's no shame in getting help when you need it." This statement was masterful in its apparent compassion, positioned as genuine concern while subtly emphasizing Mia's difficulties and need for outside assistance. It was designed to make any aggressive response seem ungrateful and unreasonable. Who could argue with someone offering help? Who would attack someone showing kindness? But Mia had learned to recognize manipulation during 3 years of dealing with Chloe's sophisticated psychological warfare. She understood that the most dangerous attacks often came disguised as assistance, that offers of help could be forms of control in disguise. Her training had taught her to look beyond surface appearances to underlying intentions. "That's very thoughtful," she said, her words coming more smoothly now as she found her rhythm. "Though I should mention that these particular pamphlets actually focus on outdated approaches that most speech pathologists have moved away from. If you're genuinely interested in learning about current treatments, I could recommend some excellent recent publications that might be more helpful." She was calling Chloe's bluff with academic precision, offering to treat the fake concern as genuine interest while simultaneously exposing the shallow research behind the attack. If Chloe's offer of help was real, she would welcome more current information. If it was performative, she would find a way to retreat without admitting the deception. The growing crowd was beginning to sense that something unusual was happening. This wasn't the typical pattern of popular kids humiliating outcasts that they had witnessed countless times before. Instead, they were watching a quiet girl with a stutter calmly dismantling a coordinated attack through superior knowledge and unshakable composure. It was like watching a chess match where one player had severely underestimated their opponent. Ryan Torres, Chloe's boyfriend and the unofficial leader of their social group, had been watching the exchange with growing irritation. As captain of the basketball team and inheritor of his family's local celebrity status, he was accustomed to situations resolving themselves through the simple application of social pressure. The fact that a stuttering junior was holding her own against his girlfriend's group was both confusing and personally embarrassing. "This is getting ridiculous," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. "Chloe was trying to be nice, and you're acting like she attacked you or something. Maybe if you spent less time being paranoid and more time working on your speech problem, you wouldn't need to make everything so complicated." The intervention was designed to reframe the entire interaction, casting Chloe as the victim of unwarranted suspicion, while positioning Mia as someone too damaged by her disability to recognize genuine kindness. It was a more sophisticated version of Jake's earlier aggression, using Ryan's social status to legitimize the attack while maintaining plausible deniability. For the first time since discovering the pamphlets, Mia felt a familiar spike of anxiety. Ryan's words carried weight that went beyond their literal meaning, the authority of someone whose opinion could influence how dozens of other students interpreted the situation. If he succeeded in reframing her response as paranoid overreaction, the careful logical structure she had built would collapse into social awkwardness. But then she remembered yesterday's presentation, the moment when she had stopped fighting her stutter and started using it as a source of strength. She remembered the feeling of finding her voice despite the obstacles, of speaking truth even when the words came hard. Most importantly, she remembered the look in Chloe's eyes when she realized that her usual tactics weren't working anymore. "You know what's interesting about paranoia?" she said, her voice gaining strength as she moved into familiar intellectual territory. "It's usually defined as irrational fear of persecution, but when the persecution is documented and systematic, the response isn't paranoid at all. It's just pattern R recognition." She pulled out her phone and scrolled to the photos she had taken of the pamphlet display. This is the fourth time this semester that educational materials about speech disorders have appeared in my locker. Last month, someone left a children's book about a stuttering rabbit. 2 weeks ago, there were printouts of speech exercises for elementary school students. The revelation stunned the gathered crowd. What had seemed like an isolated prank was revealed as part of a sustained campaign of harassment. Students who had been prepared to dismiss Mia's concerns as oversensitivity were forced to confront evidence of deliberate, repeated targeting. "I've been documenting everything," she continued, her phone now displaying a folder filled with photos and screenshots. "Not because I'm paranoid, but because PP patterns of behavior become clear when you collect enough data. This isn't about someone trying to help. This is about someone using my speech disorder as a tool for ongoing humiliation." The methodical presentation of evidence transformed the hallway confrontation into something resembling a legal proceeding. Mia had applied the same analytical skills that made her successful in academic settings to her social situation, building an irrefutable case for systematic harassment. The crowd was no longer watching entertainment. They were witnessing the exposure of behavior that many had participated in through passive observation. Chloe's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. The revelation that Mia had been documenting their interactions changed everything. What had seemed like harmless teasing could be reinterpreted as deliberate persecution when viewed as part of a larger pattern. Worse, the existence of photographic evidence meant that administrative consequences were now possible. "That's completely insane," Madison said, her voice pitched higher than usual as stress crept into her carefully maintained composure. "Nobody's harassing anybody. We're just trying to help someone who obviously needs it. If you can't handle people being nice to you, maybe the problem isn't with us." The response was pure deflection, an attempt to recast documentation as mental instability while maintaining the fiction of innocent assistance. But the crowd had seen the photos, heard the pattern described in clinical detail. The defense sounded increasingly desperate rather than persuasive. "The interesting thing about gaslighting," Mia said, her academic tone making the psychological term sound like part of a research presentation, "is that it depends on the target doubting their own perceptions. When you have documentation, the gaslighting becomes evidence of additional manipulation rather than proof of paranoia." She was using clinical terminology to describe their behavior, applying psychological concepts with the precision of someone who had studied them extensively. The effect was devastating because it removed emotion from the equation, replacing hurt feelings with analytical assessment. They weren't dealing with a wounded victim anymore. They were facing someone who understood exactly what they had been doing and could articulate it with academic clarity. Ryan was beginning to realize that the situation had spiraled far beyond his ability to control through simple social pressure. The girl he had expected to crumble under his authority was instead delivering what amounted to a case study in psychological harassment to an audience of their peers. The longer the confrontation continued, the worse his girlfriend's group looked to the growing crowd of observers. "Look, this is getting way too intense," he said, attempting to inject a note of reasonable authority into his voice. "Everyone just needs to calm down and stop making this into some huge drama. Chloe, let's just go to class and let her deal with whatever issues she's working through." The attempt to extract his girlfriend from the situation while framing Mia as someone with issues was tactically sound but poorly timed. The crowd had already seen too much evidence to accept the suggestion that the problem lay with the victim rather than the perpetrators. The dismissive tone only reinforced the impression that the popular students considered themselves above accountability for their actions. "Actually, I think this conversation is quite valuable," Mia said, her composure remaining steady despite the escalating tension. "It's providing excellent real-time examples of the defense mechanisms that people use when their behavior patterns are exposed to scrutiny." She was treating the entire confrontation as a learning opportunity, analyzing their responses with the detached interest of a researcher observing subject behavior. The approach was both brilliant and infuriating, transforming their attempts at social control into material for psychological study. Chloe finally found her voice, though it carried none of its usual confident authority. "You're being completely ridiculous," she said, her words coming faster than usual as stress affected her typically perfect diction. "We've never done anything to hurt you. If you can't handle normal social interaction, without turning it into some kind of conspiracy theory, maybe you should talk to the counselor about medication or something. The suggestion of medication was a particularly vicious attack, designed to pathologize Mia's response while implying that her speech disorder was connected to broader mental health issues. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated cruelty that had made Chloe such an effective bully, capable of devastating damage while maintaining plausible deniability. But the comment proved to be a tactical error. By suggesting that Mia needed medication for her responses, Chloe had inadvertently admitted that the responses were to specific stimuli rather than random paranoia. She had also revealed her own desperation, abandoning subtle manipulation for crude attempts at character assassination. "That's an interesting recommendation," Mia said, her voice carrying a new quality that made several students in the crowd step closer to hear better. Especially since it comes from someone who spent yesterday's presentation deliberately interrupting and mocking my speech patterns in front of the entire class. The accusation was direct and specific, supported by the testimony of everyone who had witnessed yesterday's events. Students who had been in Mrs. Henderson's class began nodding, remembering Chloe's calculated interruptions and mimicry. The pattern of behavior was becoming undeniable as more evidence accumulated. "I was trying to help," Chloe protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "I could see you were struggling, and I thought maybe if you took a break or slowed down, it would be easier for everyone to understand." "By mimicking my stutter?" Mia asked, her words cutting through the hallway noise with unexpected clarity. "By suggesting I should give up speaking and just hand out written notes instead? That's your definition of help?" The crowd had gone completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. This wasn't typical high school drama. It was a careful deconstruction of behavior that many of them had observed but never questioned. Students who had laughed at Chloe's helpfulness were beginning to understand how calculated and cruel it had actually been. Jake, sensing that his group was losing control of the narrative, decided to escalate with characteristic directness. "Jesus Christ! Enough with the victim act," he said, his voice loud enough to echo off the lockers. "Nobody gives a shit about your little documentation project or your conspiracy theories about speech therapy pamphlets. You want to know the truth? Yeah, we think it's funny when you can't get words out. So does half the school. Deal with it." The admission was exactly what Mia had been hoping for, a moment of honest cruelty that stripped away all pretense of innocent intent. Jake had just confessed to finding entertainment in her disability, validating everything she had documented and observed over the past 3 years. More importantly, he had done it in front of dozens of witnesses who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen what was really happening. "Thank you for that honesty," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. "It's exactly the kind of deep, direct admission that makes documentation so valuable. When people finally stop pretending their cruelty is kindness, the real motivations become clear." She was thanking him for providing evidence, treating his moment of vicious honesty as a gift rather than an attack. The response was so unexpected that Jake actually stepped backward, confused by her complete lack of hurt or embarrassment. He had expected tears, anger, or retreat. Instead, he was facing someone who seemed almost grateful for his cruelty. The hallway had filled with students now, drawn by the unusual nature of the confrontation and the growing realization that something unprecedented was happening. Word was spreading through text messages and social media that the quiet girl with the stutter was somehow holding her own against Chloe Martinez's entire crew. People were arriving to witness what many sensed might be a historic shift in the school's social dynamics. Chloe looked around at the growing crowd with growing panic. What had started as a simple reassertion of dominance had become a public trial of her behavior, with evidence presented and witnesses gathering. Worse, the girl she had been tormenting for months was proving to be far more formidable than anyone had suspected. The quiet, stuttering victim had somehow transformed into a confident prosecutor building an airtight case. "This is insane," she said, her voice rising as her carefully maintained composure finally began to crack. "You're acting like we committed some kind of crime or something. It's high school. People tease each other. That's normal. You're the one making it weird by obsessing over every little thing that happens to you." The defense was pure normalization, an attempt to reframe systematic harassment as typical adolescent behavior that only seemed significant because of Mia's supposed oversensitivity. It was a common tactic used by bullies when their behavior was exposed. Claimed that the victim's response was disproportionate to normal social interaction. But Mia had been preparing for this exact argument for months, studying the psychology of harassment and the defensive strategies used by perpetrators when confronted with evidence. Her response was immediate and devastatingly precise. "You're absolutely right that teasing is normal in high school," she agreed, her tone remaining analytical despite the emotional weight of the topic. "But systematic targeting of someone's disability over a period of months crosses the line from social interaction into harassment. The fact that it happens in a school setting doesn't make it legal or acceptable." She paused, looking around at the crowd of faces that had gathered to witness the confrontation. "The difference between normal teasing and harassment is pattern, persistence, and power differential. When someone with social status repeatedly targets someone without it, using their disability as the primary vector of attack, that's not just mean. It's discriminatory harassment based on disability status." The legal terminology landed like bombs in the silence that followed. Mia wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was describing potential civil rights violations. Students who had participated in or witnessed the harassment were beginning to understand that they might have been part of something with serious consequences beyond hurt feelings. Madison looked genuinely frightened now, her usual confident cruelty replaced by the dawning realization that their behavior could have legal implications. "Nobody said anything about lawyers or courts or whatever," she stammered. "This is just high school stuff. You can't sue people for being mean in high school." "Actually," Mia said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had done extensive research, "the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to educational environments. Schools have legal obligations to prevent harassment based on disability status. When they fail to address documented patterns of discriminatory behavior, they can face federal civil rights investigations." The revelation that she understood the legal framework surrounding her situation changed everything. This wasn't an emotional teenager complaining about hurt feelings. This was someone who had studied her rights and understood exactly what protections existed. The documentation she had been collecting wasn't just personal records. It was potential evidence in federal civil rights proceedings. Ryan was beginning to understand just how badly his girlfriend's campaign against Mia had backfired. What had seemed like harmless entertainment was being reframed as potential federal civil rights violations. The girl they had dismissed as powerless was revealing depths of knowledge and preparation that none of them had suspected. "Look, nobody wants any trouble," he said, his tone shifting towards something that might have been conciliation if it weren't so obviously motivated by fear. "If there's been some kind of misunderstanding, maybe we can all just move forward and forget about it. High school's almost over anyway." The offer to move forward was classic damage control, an attempt to end the situation before it escalated further, while implying that the problem lay in misunderstanding rather than deliberate harassment. It was also an implicit admission that there was trouble to be avoided, that their behavior had crossed lines they were only now beginning to recognize. Mia studied his expression with the same careful attention she brought to analyzing sparring opponents before matches. She could see the calculation behind his words, the fear masquerading as reasonableness. More importantly, she could see that he was beginning to understand what she had known for months, that power derived from popularity was fragile when confronted with knowledge, documentation, and legal frameworks. "That's an interesting perspective," she said, her words measured and deliberate. "The idea that discriminatory harassment becomes acceptable if enough time passes, or that victims should forget documented patterns of abuse to make perpetrators more comfortable." She was deconstructing his offer with surgical precision, exposing the assumptions and entitlement that lay beneath his apparent reasonableness. The suggestion that she should move forward for their convenience revealed how little they understood about the impact of their behavior or the nature of the situation they had created. "But here's what I find most fascinating," she continued, her voice growing stronger as she moved toward her conclusion. "For 3 years, you've all operated under the assumption that I would never fight back, that I would continue to accept harassment indefinitely, because I was too weak or too scared to defend myself. The crowd was hanging on every word now, sensing that something significant was building. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a moment of transformation, a quiet revolution happening in the hallway of Lincoln High School. "What you never considered," Mia said, her eyes moving from face to face among her tormentors, "is that some people are quiet not because they're weak, but because they're choosing when to speak. Some people absorb attacks not because they see us can't fight back, but because they're waiting for the right moment to respond." The words carried a weight that went beyond their literal meaning, a promise of consequences that had been building for months of documented harassment. Chloe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air, a recognition that the girl she had been tormenting possessed depths of strength and strategy that she had never suspected. "The right moment for what?" Chloe asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Mia smiled, and for the first time since the confrontation began, her expression held something that might have been anticipation. "For showing you exactly what happens when someone who's been learning to fight decides to stop being quiet." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of and had been waiting patiently for the right opportunity to demonstrate it. The crowd sensed the shift in dynamics, the moment when victim became aggressor and hunters became prey. The bell rang, signaling the start of first period, but nobody moved. They could all sense that something fundamental was about to change, that the careful social hierarchies that had governed their school for years were about to be challenged by someone who had been underestimated for far too long. Mia shouldered her backpack, now heavy with the collected evidence of months of harassment, and looked one final time at the group that had made her life miserable for 3 years. "See you around," she said simply, her words carrying the weight of a promise rather than a casual farewell. As she walked away toward her first class, students parted before her, like water, sensing that the quiet girl with a stutter had somehow become someone entirely different. Behind her, Chloe and her friends stood in stunned silence, finally beginning to understand that they had been playing a game where they didn't know the rules, against an opponent who had been studying their every move. The real confrontation was still coming, but the foundation had been laid. Mia Chen was no longer hiding her strength, no longer accepting harassment in silence. She had revealed just enough of her capabilities to let them know that 3 years of systematic cruelty were about to have consequences they had never imagined. The war was about to begin in earnest, and for the first time, Chloe Martinez was beginning to suspect that she might not win. The confrontation that would change everything began in the most mundane possible way. With Mia eating lunch alone in the courtyard, her sandwich untouched beside an open biology textbook. She had chosen the outdoor table specifically because it offered multiple exit routes and clear sight lines, habits developed through 3 years of avoiding unwanted encounters. The October air was crisp enough to keep most students inside, which meant she could study in peace while preparing for her afternoon exam. What she didn't expect was for Chloe's entire crew to emerge from the cafeteria with the deliberate coordination of a military unit executing a planned operation. They moved across the courtyard with purpose, their formation designed to cut off escape routes while appearing casual to any supervising teachers who might glance outside. Ryan led the approach with his usual swagger, Madison and Jake flanking him on either side, while Chloe hung back slightly, her expression unreadable behind designer sunglasses despite the overcast sky. Mia sensed their approach before she saw them, the same instinctive awareness that Master Tanaka had taught her to cultivate during sparring sessions. The sudden silence in the courtyard, the shift in ambient energy that preceded confrontation. She closed her textbook calmly and placed both hands flat on the table, centering herself the way she had learned to do before tournaments. Her breathing became deliberate and controlled, drawing on years of meditation training that had taught her to find stillness in the midst of chaos. "Well, well," Ryan announced as they reached her table, his voice carrying the artificial joviality that preceded cruelty. "Look who's studying outside, all by herself. Don't you have any friends to eat with? Or did they all get tired of waiting for you to finish sentences?" The attack was designed to isolate and humiliate, emphasizing her solitude while mocking her speech impediment. But Mia had learned to recognize the psychology behind such tactics, the way bullies needed to establish dominance through verbal aggression before escalating to other forms of harassment. She looked up at Ryan with the same analytical calm she brought to studying opponents across the dojo mat. "I prefer studying alone," she said simply, her words coming without the stutter that typically emerged under stress. The absence of her usual speech difficulty was so unexpected that Ryan actually paused, thrown off balance by her composed response. It's more efficient when you don't have to slow down for people who aren't as academically focused. The subtle implication that she was intellectually superior to them landed like a precise strike, drawing immediate reactions from the group. Madison stepped forward aggressively, her face flushing with indignation at the suggestion that anyone might consider her academically inferior. "Excuse me?" Madison's voice pitched higher than usual, stress affecting her carefully cultivated composure. "Did you just call us stupid? That's rich coming from someone who can't even order food without having a breakdown." "I didn't call anyone anything," Mia replied, her tone remaining level despite the escalating hostility surrounding her table. "I simply stated that I study more efficiently alone. If you interpreted that as a CC comment on your intellectual capabilities, that might be worth examining." She was using their own aggression against them, allowing their insecurities to fill in implications she had never explicitly made. It was a technique she had learned from watching Master Tanaka handle aggressive students, the way he could redirect energy without ever engaging directly with the attack itself. Jake, who had been growing increasingly frustrated with Mia's composed responses over the past 2 days, decided to abandon subtlety entirely. "Cut the act," he snarled, moving closer to her table in a way that was clearly designed to intimidate. "We all know what happened in the hallway yesterday. You think you're some kind of genius because you took a few pictures and learned some big words?" His proximity was a calculated violation of personal space, a physical intimidation tactic that relied on the target's natural instinct to retreat when faced with aggressive body language. But Mia remained seated, her posture relaxed and her hands still flat on the table. She looked up at Jake with the same measuring gaze she had used countless times to assess sparring partners, cataloging his stance, his balance, his apparent level of physical conditioning. "I think documentation is important when dealing with patterns of harassment," she said, her voice carrying no trace of fear despite his looming presence. "And I think understanding legal frameworks helps people make informed decisions about their behavior." "Legal frameworks?" Chloe repeated mockingly, finally stepping forward to join the confrontation directly. "Listen to her trying to sound important. You're 17 years old, and you can barely talk. Nobody's going to take you seriously if you try to cause trouble for us." The attack was designed to infantilize and dismiss, reducing Mia's knowledge to pretension while emphasizing her youth and speech impediment. But Chloe had made a tactical error by engaging directly, rather than maintaining her usual position of orchestrating attacks through others. She was now personally invested in the confrontation, which meant her judgment would be affected by emotion rather than strategy. "Age doesn't determine credibility when you have documentation," Mia replied, her academic tone contrasting sharply with their increasingly aggressive approach. "Federal civil rights law doesn't include exceptions for high school SS settings or teenage perpetrators." She pulled out her phone and placed it on the table beside her textbook, the device positioned to capture whatever happened next. The action was deliberate and visible, a clear signal that this encounter was being recorded for potential legal use. Several members of the group glanced nervously at the phone, suddenly aware that their words and actions were being preserved as evidence. "You can't record us without permission," Madison said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. "That's illegal or something." "Actually, Oregon is a one-party consent state for audio recording," Mia explained with the patience of someone correcting a common misconception. "And this is a public school courtyard with no expectation of privacy. Recording is perfectly legal and often recommended for documenting harassment incidents." Her knowledge of recording laws was another surprise that threw them off balance, evidence of preparation and research that went far beyond what they had expected from their target. They were beginning to realize that the quiet girl they had been tormenting possessed depths of strategic thinking that none of them had suspected. Ryan, frustrated by his group's inability to rattle their intended victim, decided to escalate the situation through direct intimidation. He moved around the table to stand directly behind Mia's chair, using his size and position to create a sense of physical threat without actually touching her. "You know what your problem is," he said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that was still clearly audible to her phone's microphone. "You think being smart makes you better than everyone else, but intelligence doesn't mean shit when you're dealing with real people in the real world." The threat was implicit but unmistakable, a suggestion that intellectual superiority was meaningless when faced with physical intimidation. It was exactly the kind of escalation that Mia had been expecting, the moment when verbal harassment transformed into something more dangerous. Instead of showing fear, she turned slightly in her chair to look up at him, her movement fluid and controlled. "That's an interesting perspective," she said, her voice remaining steady despite his intimidating presence. "The idea that intelligence is irrelevant in real-world situations. Is that why you're approaching a conflict through peef intimidation rather than logical argument?" She was analyzing his behavior in real time, treating his attempt at intimidation as a case study in aggressive psychology. The clinical detachment in her voice was more unnerving than fear or anger would have been, suggesting a level of control and preparation that he hadn't anticipated. "I'm not intimidating anybody," Ryan protested, though his position behind her chair suggested otherwise. "I'm just having a conversation. Maybe if you weren't so paranoid, you'd realize that not everything is an attack." Positioning yourself directly behind someone who can't easily retreat while discussing how intelligence doesn't matter in real-world situations could certainly be interpreted as intimidation, Mia observed, her tone remaining conversational despite the obvious threat, particularly when it's being recorded as part of a documented pattern of harassment. She was narrating his behavior for the recording, creating a verbal record that would make his intentions clear to anyone who reviewed the evidence later. The technique transformed his intimidation tactic into self-incriminating evidence, using his own aggression against him in ways he was too focused on dominance to recognize. Chloe, sensing that the situation was sliding out of control again, attempted to regain narrative control through a display of reasonable authority. "This is getting ridiculous," she announced loudly enough for any observing students to hear. "We came over here to try to clear the air after yesterday's misunderstanding, and she's treating us like criminals." The reframing was skillful, casting their coordinated intimidation as a peace offering, while positioning Mia's defensive responses as unreasonable aggression. It was designed to appeal to any witnesses who might testify about the encounter later, creating plausible deniability for their true intentions. "What specifically did you want to clear up?" Mia asked, her question cutting through the false narrative with surgical precision. "The documentation of systematic harassment? The admission that you find my speech impediment entertaining? The legal implications of disability-based discrimination in educational settings?" Each point was delivered with academic precision, stripping away the fiction of misunderstanding to reveal the underlying pattern of deliberate cruelty. She was forcing them to address the specific behaviors they had engaged in, rather than hiding behind vague claims of miscommunication. Jake, his frustration reaching a boiling point, abandoned any pretense of reasonable discourse. "Shut up with your stupid legal bullshit," he snarled, stepping closer to her table with clenched fists. "You think you're untouchable because you learned some fancy words? Let me tell you what's going to happen to smart-mouthed freaks who don't know their place." The explicit threat was exactly what Mia had been waiting for, the moment when their harassment crossed the line into criminal territory. She remained seated, her hands still flat on the table, but her posture had shifted subtly into a position that would allow for rapid movement if necessary. "Could you be more specific about what's going to happen?" she asked, her voice carrying no trace of fear despite the obvious menace in his approach. "I want to make sure the recording captures your intentions clearly." The request for clarification was both brave and tactically brilliant, forcing Jake to either retreat from his threat or make it explicit enough to constitute criminal intimidation. Either choice would benefit her case while exposing the true nature of their behavior to any witnesses or investigators. "You really want to know?" Jake said, his voice rising as his anger overcame his judgment. "Fine. Here's what happens to freaky little bitches who think they can threaten us." He lunged forward, reaching for her phone with the obvious intention of destroying the evidence she had been collecting. The move was clumsy and telegraphed, driven by rage rather than strategy. To someone with 3 years of martial arts training, it might as well have been broadcast in advance. Mia moved with liquid precision, her response so smooth and economical that observers would later disagree about exactly what they had seen. She rose from her chair in a single fluid motion, her left hand deflecting Jake's reaching arm while her right palm struck his solar plexus with controlled force. The technique was textbook perfect, designed to disable without causing permanent damage. Jake collapsed backward, gasping for air and clutching his chest. The strike had been precisely calibrated to wind him without breaking ribs, a demonstration of skill that spoke to years of training and careful control. He hit the ground hard, his face red and his breathing labored, but he would recover fully within minutes. The transformation was so sudden and complete that the rest of the group froze in shock. The quiet girl they had been intimidating had moved like lightning, displaying a level of physical competence that none of them had suspected. Madison actually stepped backward, her mouth open in surprise at the speed and precision of the technique. "That was assault," Ryan said, though his voice lacked the authority he had displayed moments earlier. "We have witnesses. You just attacked Jake for no reason." "Actually," Mia said, settling back into her chair with the same fluid grace she had shown in rising, "that was self-defense against attempted destruction of evidence. Jake explicitly threatened me and then lunged for my phone. The entire sequence is recorded, along with his verbal threats and your coordinated intimidation." She gestured to Jake, who was still gasping on the ground but beginning to recover his breath. "As you can see, I used minimal force necessary to stop his attack. He's not seriously injured, just winded. If I had intended to cause real damage, the outcome would have been very different." The casual way she discussed alternative levels of violence was perhaps more unnerving than the technique itself. She was revealing that the gentle precision she had used was a choice rather than a limitation, that she possessed capabilities far beyond what she had demonstrated. Chloe looked from Jake to Mia with dawning recognition that everything they thought they knew about their victim had been wrong. "You've been pretending to be weak," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of anger and fear. "This whole time you could have fought back, but you let us think you were helpless." "I never pretended to be weak," Mia corrected, her tone remaining conversational despite the tension in the air. "I chose restraint over violence because that's what civilized people do. But when someone makes physical attacks inevitable, restraint becomes a luxury I can't afford." She looked around at the group, her gaze measuring each of them with the same analytical precision she had applied to Jake before defending herself. "The question now is whether the rest of you want to continue this encounter, or if you'd prefer to help Jake to the nurse's office and reconsider your approach to conflict resolution." The offer was phrased as a choice, but the implicit threat was clear. She had demonstrated that their physical intimidation was ineffective against her, that their assumed advantages of size and numbers meant nothing when faced with superior training and technique. The power dynamic had shifted completely in the span of a few seconds. Madison, who had been Jake's most enthusiastic supporter, was backing away steadily now. "This is crazy," she said, her voice shaky with adrenaline and fear. "She's obviously been planning this. Normal people don't just know how to fight like that. Normal people don't systematically harass classmates with disabilities for months either," Mia pointed out reasonably. "Everyone makes choices about how to respond to conflict. I chose training and preparation. You chose cruelty and intimidation. Today we discovered which approach is more effective." Jake was finally able to stand, though he remained hunched over and breathing carefully. The strike had been precisely calculated to disable without permanent injury, but the psychological impact was far greater than the physical damage. He had learned in the most direct way possible that his assumptions about power and vulnerability had been completely wrong. "This isn't over," he wheezed, though the threat lacked conviction. "You can't hide behind karate or whatever forever. There are other ways to make your life miserable." "That's an interesting choice of words," Mia said, pulling out her phone to stop the recording and immediately uploading it to cloud storage. "Explicitly stating your intention to continue harassment after being physically defeated in your initial attempt. Most people would consider that evidence of persistent criminal behavior." She was documenting his threat in real time, adding it to the growing collection of evidence that could be used in legal proceedings. Her calm professionalism in the face of continued aggression demonstrated a level of preparation and strategic thinking that went far beyond typical teenage conflict resolution. Ryan, finally understanding that the situation had spiraled beyond his ability to control, attempted one last assertion of social authority. "Nobody's going to believe that Jake attacked you," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Everyone knows you're the weird one. They'll think you started this because you're mentally unstable or something." "Actually," Mia said, her academic tone returning as she addressed his desperate attempt at narrative control, "I have the entire encounter recorded, including Jake's explicit threats and his attempted destruction of evidence. I also have months of documented harassment and witnesses to your coordinated intimidation today." She gestured to the windows overlooking the courtyard, where several faces could be seen watching the unprecedented confrontation. More importantly, the physical evidence will support my version of events. Jake has no injuries consistent with unprovoked assault, just the specific effects of a defensive technique designed to stop an attack without causing permanent damage. The thoroughness of her legal preparation was becoming clear, evidence of months of research and planning that had anticipated exactly this kind of escalation. She had been ready for their harassment to cross into criminal territory, prepared with both the defensive skills and the legal knowledge necessary to protect herself. Chloe, who had remained silent during the exchange, finally spoke with a voice that carried none of its usual authority. "What do you want?" she asked simply. "Money? An apology? What's it going to take to make this go away?" The question revealed her complete misunderstanding of the situation, the assumption that Mia's resistance could be bought off or negotiated away like any other teenage conflict. It showed how fundamentally she had misread the character of the person she had been tormenting for months. "I want the harassment to stop," Mia said, her words carrying the weight of 3 years of accumulated pain and anger. "I want you to understand that your actions have consequences, and I want everyone who witnessed this encounter to understand that victims don't have to remain victims forever." She stood up from the table, gathering her textbook and phone with deliberate care. "But most importantly, I want you to know that the quiet girl you've been tormenting for 3 years isn't quiet because she's weak. She's quiet because she's been learning to be strong." The revelation hung in the air between them, a promise and a threat wrapped in academic language. They were beginning to understand that they had been playing a game where they didn't know the rules, against an opponent who had been studying their every move while preparing for exactly this moment. "This changes nothing," Chloe said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You might know some martial arts, but you're still a freak who can't even talk normally. People won't forget that just because you can throw a punch." "You're absolutely right that this changes everything," Mia replied, shouldering her backpack with the same fluid grace she had shown in her defensive movement. "Just not in the way you expect. Today, everyone learned that intelligence and preparation can overcome size and aggression. They learned that victims can become fighters when they're pushed too far." She looked around at each member of the group, her gaze steady and measuring. "But most importantly, they learned that I'm not the same person who started high school 3 years ago. I'm someone who's been training for exactly this moment, someone who's prepared for whatever CC comes next." As she walked away from the table, students parted before her with the same respectful distance they might show a dangerous animal. Word of the confrontation was already spreading through the school's social networks, videos and eyewitness accounts transforming the quiet girl with the stutter into something approaching legend. Behind her, Chloe's group stood in stunned silence, finally beginning to understand that their reign of harassment had come to an end. They had discovered that their victim possessed capabilities they had never suspected, backed by knowledge and preparation that made their crude intimidation tactics seem childish and ineffective. The war was over before they had even realized it was being fought, lost by people who had confused cruelty with strength and silence with weakness. Mia Chen was no longer hiding her capabilities, no longer accepting abuse in the name of keeping peace. She had finally shown them exactly what happened when someone who had been learning to fight decided to stop being quiet. The video hit social media within 20 minutes of the courtyard incident. Someone had filmed the entire encounter from a classroom window, capturing everything from Jake's aggressive approach to his gasping collapse after Mia's precise defensive strike. By the end of the school day, the footage had spread across every platform Lincoln High students used, accompanied by captions that ranged from "Quiet girl destroys bully" to "Stutter girl has secret martial arts skills." Principal Davidson called Mia to his office during 7th period, his expression grave as he reviewed the recorded evidence on his computer screen. She sat across from his desk with the same composed demeanor she had maintained throughout the confrontation, her hands folded calmly while he processed what he was seeing. "Miss Chen," he began carefully, "I've reviewed the incident footage and your documentation of prior harassment. While I cannot condone violence on school grounds, the evidence clearly shows you acted in self-defense against an unprovoked attack." The relief in his voice was obvious. 3 years of complaints about Chloe's group had been dismissed or minimized due to their family's influence and the subtle nature of their harassment. Now he had irrefutable evidence of their behavior and a victim who had defended herself within legal boundaries. The Martinez family has already contacted the school demanding your expulsion, he continued. But their daughter's recorded behavior makes that impossible. Instead, I'll be implementing immediate consequences for the harassment campaign against you. Within an hour, Chloe, Ryan, Jake, and Madison were suspended pending a formal disciplinary hearing. Their parents arrived at the school in expensive cars and tailored suits, demanding meetings with administrators and threatening legal action. But the evidence was overwhelming, captured in high definition from multiple angles, and supported by months of Mia's meticulous documentation. The transformation in school culture was immediate and profound. Students who had ignored or participated in Mia's harassment now approached her with cautious respect. Teachers who had overlooked the systematic bullying suddenly took notice of her academic achievements and classroom contributions. The quiet girl who had been invisible for 3 years became the center of attention she had never wanted. "How long have you been training?" Sarah Kim asked during lunch the next day, sliding into the seat across from Mia's usual table. Sarah was student council vice president, someone who had maintained polite distance from social conflicts, but had clearly been moved by what she witnessed. 3 years, Mia replied simply, her words coming without the stress-induced stutter that had plagued her for so long. The reduction in daily anxiety had already begun affecting her speech patterns, though she knew the impediment would never disappear entirely. "That was incredible," Sarah continued, her voice filled with genuine admiration. "The way you stayed so calm while they were threatening you. I would have been terrified." Other students gathered around the table, drawn by curiosity about the girl who had shattered their assumptions about strength and vulnerability. They asked about her training, her techniques, whether she planned to compete in tournaments. For the first time in her high school career, Mia found herself at the center of positive attention. The formal disciplinary hearing took place a week later in the district's main conference room. Chloe's father brought 2 lawyers and a private investigator who had attempted to find evidence of Mia's aggression. Jake's parents hired a personal injury attorney despite their son's complete lack of serious injuries. Ryan's mother demanded character witnesses testifying to her son's good nature and community involvement. Mia arrived with her parents, her months of documentation, and a quiet confidence that needed no legal representation. The evidence spoke for itself: recorded harassment, systematic targeting, explicit threats, and finally, physical attack, met with minimal defensive force. The hearing lasted 3 hours and ended with permanent expulsions for all 4 students. "The district cannot tolerate disability-based harassment," the hearing officer announced. "These students engaged in systematic persecution of a classmate over her speech impediment, escalating to criminal intimidation and attempted assault. Their actions violated both school policy and federal civil rights law." The families appealed the decision through every available channel, hiring expensive attorneys and calling in political favors. But the legal framework was clear, the evidence undeniable, and the public attention intense. Local news stations had picked up the story of the stuttering girl who fought back, turning it into a symbol of standing up to bullies and protecting disabled students. Master Tanaka watched the news coverage from his small office at the dojo, a slight smile playing across his weathered features. When Mia arrived for training that evening, he bowed formally to her, a gesture of respect reserved for exceptional demonstrations of character under pressure. "You honored the art," he said simply. "Control in chaos. Minimum force for maximum effect. The warrior's discipline." "I was scared," Mia admitted, removing her shoes at the dojo entrance. "Not of getting hurt, but of hurting them too badly. When Jake attacked, I could have done so much more damage." "That fear is wisdom," Master Tanaka replied. "Power without restraint is not martial arts. It is merely violence. You chose the path of the protector, not the destroyer." Training that night felt different. Other students looked at her with new respect, understanding that her years of quiet dedication had produced something remarkable. The girl who had started martial arts as therapy for anxiety had become someone capable of defending herself and others with precision and control. The college acceptance letter arrived in March, offering her a full academic scholarship to study psychology with a focus on disability advocacy. Her grades had always been excellent, but the national attention from her story had brought opportunities she never could have imagined. Universities wanted students who had overcome adversity and demonstrated character under pressure. Graduation day found her delivering the salutatorian speech to a packed auditorium. Her parents sat in the front row, tears in their eyes as they watched their daughter command the stage with confidence that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. "Strength comes in many forms," she told the assembled graduates and families. "Sometimes it looks like the ability to absorb punishment without breaking. Sometimes it looks like the discipline to train for years without knowing if you'll ever need those skills. But sometimes strength looks like finally saying enough." The slight stutter was still there, but it no longer carried shame or embarrassment. It had become part of who she was, a reminder of obstacles overcome rather than limitations accepted. Chloe sat in the audience with her new private school classmates, having transferred after the expulsion destroyed her social standing at Lincoln. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded auditorium, and for a moment, something passed between them that might have been understanding. The girl who had built her identity on controlling others had learned that some people couldn't be controlled. The girl who had accepted abuse for years had learned that acceptance was a choice, not a requirement. The martial arts scholarship to a university dojo program meant Mia could continue training while pursuing her degree. She planned to become an advocate for students with disabilities, using her psychology background to help others find their voices and their strength. The quiet girl who had documented harassment was becoming someone who would prevent it from happening to others. 5 years later, Dr. Mia Chen opened her practice specializing in adolescent therapy and disability advocacy. Her office walls displayed her black belt certificate alongside her doctorate, visible reminders that strength took many forms and came from unexpected places. Students with speech impediments, learning disabilities, and social anxiety found their way to her, drawn by someone who understood their struggles from the inside. The stuttering girl who had been mocked for her differences had become a voice for others who felt voiceless. The victim who had documented abuse had become a protector who prevented it. The quiet student who had absorbed years of harassment had become someone who taught others that silence was a choice, not a sentence. Sometimes former Lincoln High students would recognize her name in news articles about disability rights advocacy, or see her interviewed about anti-bullying programs. They would remember the girl who couldn't order lunch without struggling, then recall the precise movement that ended Jake Williams's attack in the school courtyard. The transformation seemed impossible until they understood it had been happening all along, hidden beneath years of careful preparation and quiet determination. Mia kept one memento from her high school years, the phone that had recorded her final confrontation with Chloe's group, not as a trophy or reminder of victory, but as evidence that documentation and preparation could overcome intimidation and abuse. That sometimes the best defense against cruelty was the patience to let bullies destroy themselves while building the strength to stand when standing became necessary. The quiet girl with the stutter had found her voice, and it turned out to be stronger than anyone had imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.